Let's do this. The Cult of Hockey podcast by the faithful and for the faithful. I'm David Staples of the Edmonton Journal, and I'm here today with Bruce McCurdy. Welcome, Bruce.
Hey, David.
How you doing? You got a bit of a cold?
Yeah, my throat is all acting up and it's kind of on fire today. So if I'm sounding a little grumpy, all that might be true. And if I'm sounding a little deeper than usual, that's probably true also.
So, Bruce, the good news today, a tough day in economic news, but we won't get into that. The good news today is it's August 31st, Bruce, and we somehow have made it through another summer of posting every day about the Edmonton Oilers. We found enough news to talk about. Actually, there's been a lot of news this summer. There was the Lucic saga seemed to be never ending, the back and forth. And that was a weird story from beginning to end. It seems in the end, I'm just wondering what the hell happened there, but it did. There was lots to say about it all summer long, and there was some junior tournaments, one in Edmonton, and there's a bit more. The ongoing news of the summer is Darnell Nurse, who's not yet signed a contract, and training camp is looming.
Here we are, August 31st, and he's still out there.
So he did make some interesting comments at the BioSteel camp, essentially that he's keen to sign a contract and doesn't see it as a problem. He wants to get back with the boys and play for the Oilers, and said all the right things that you hope to hear from a player. Like, he didn't sound at all like a guy who's gearing up, from his perspective at least, to hold out and it's going to be any kind of a problem. So that, I thought that was good to hear.
Yeah, his bargaining position is not strong in that, he didn't have arbitration rights. And so he really just, the possibilities of an offer sheet seem remote. I wrote about that myself at one point, but it's just a matter of finding a term and a figure. And it's really, is it going to be a bridge? Is it probably more likely 2-year than 1-year bridge at 3 point something, or is he going to sign long term? And finally, the logjam appears to have been broken this morning, because there's 4 defensemen of sort of similar quality and in a very similar situation in Noah Hanifin in Calgary, Josh Morrissey in Winnipeg, Shea Theodore in Las Vegas, and Darnell Nurse in Edmonton, all of whom played through their ELC and are now looking for a second pact. And this morning, Calgary made a breakthrough, signing Hanifin to a 6-year deal with an annual average value of $4.95 million. So let's call it $5 million, and we will use that as a template for the other guys, and specifically, of course, you and I want to talk about Darnell Nurse.
So I've always thought if the Oilers were going to sign Nurse to a long-term contract, Bruce, and I'm certainly was open to that possibility. Well, first of all, it would be difficult to do, as we both know, because the Oilers are pressed up against the cap for this coming year. Didn't seem to be money to do it, because you're going to have to get into the $4 million range with Nurse, and that was always clear if you're going to go long-term with the guy. But with Sekera being injured, it seems to me that there might be some financial wiggle room to make that long-term deal work, and then you'd have to make it work the season after, but you could probably do that as well. So I think that's a possibility. I always wonder what that amount might be. And I would have been okay with what I call the Larson-Klefbom contract, which was a long-term deal at $4.167 million per year, essentially $4.2 million a year. When they signed it a few years ago, both those players signed their deals against the lower cap. So you have to factor in, okay, what would that look like? What would the Larson-Klefbom contract look like today? And I guess you could work it out numerically, like you could actually work out the exact ratio. But the Hanifin deal, I think it's a little less than the Hanifin deal, actually. I think if I'm not mistaken, it's more like 4.7 or something like that. But and again, I think I did the numbers in my head once, but the Hanifin deal seems like about what the Larson-Klefbom contract might be. Now, Hanifin, he's an interesting player, Bruce, because he only played 19 minutes a game last year. He was essentially 4-5, third pairing 4-5 demon last year on the Hurricanes. He wasn't necessarily in their top 4. And usually the Larson Clefbaum deal would go to a top 4 D-man, which Nurse definitely was and projects to be. And I guess Calgary's projecting Hanifin to be that, although he wasn't that last year. But I think it would be difficult for the Nurse camp to argue that he has much more value than Hanifin on the NHL trade market or just as a player. I mean, I wouldn't want to trade. Personally, I wouldn't want to see Darnell Nurse traded for Noah Hanifin, but other people might make that deal. So what if the Oilers signed? What would you think if the Oilers signed Nurse $4.9 million to the Hanifin deal? What would you think of that?
Well, there's arguments to be made on both sides, of course, as usual. To do the strictly numerical thing, both Larson and Clefbaum signed in 2015-16, although Clefbaum actually signed in advance for a contract that wouldn't kick in until the following season. At that point, the cap was $73 million. Now it's 79.5, about 9% higher. So their value turns into a little bit more than 4.5 million in terms of percent of today's cap. So you can set the bar there if you think that those are comparable players. I'm looking at what Sportsnet.ca has written today about the Hanifin signing affecting the others, and they say as important as a Cam Talbot bounce back is to Edmonton's fortunes, Nurse's ascensions towards number 1 status will be a huge contributing factor as well. 2 years older than Hanifin, but similarly coming off his entry-level deal, Nurse would be looking at a higher AAV on a long-term extension. Brady Shea's $5.25 million deal with the Rangers might be a good starting point.
Yeah, I'm not buying that argument, Bruce. I think Calgary is overpaid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Hanifin projects like he's a top 4 defenseman. Mm-hmm. And what makes his situation better than Larson or Clefbaum? You know, it should be in that same range. So it looks like an overpay to me. Like, I'm happy with Nurse on a long-term deal at like 4.6, even 4.7.
Mm-hmm.
You get above that and you're overpaying, I think, for this player. There was a lot of players in the Nurse. They weren't the only ones signing for about that amount of money long-term in that same situation. So why would that same class of player be getting paid a higher percentage of the cap now? Does that make sense? And I don't think is there an argument that it makes sense? I don't know.
Well, the argument for Hanifin is that he's a point producer, and those guys generally get paid more. He scored 22 points as a 18 to 19-year-old rookie. He's a January birthday, so middle of the season. Then he scored 29 points. Then he scored 32 points last year, including 10 goals, which only 30 defensemen league-wide scored 10 goals. Now, for his part, Nurse got 26 points, and they were all at even strength, whereas Hanifin got 25 at even strength and 7 on the power play. So some people would value him more equally as offensive player, but points are points, and contracts get paid on boxcars, and I think power play defensemen tend to get overpaid a little bit just for that. And it's not like, Hanifin had 7 points on the power play. It's not like he had 25 points or anything, but that's what put him into the next range of point scores in the 30-plus range. And projecting him as a younger player forward, like he's 21 and he's already got 239 NHL games under his belt, which is phenomenal. 3 full seasons of 79 to 81 games. Nurse, of course, he lost half a year in 2016-17 to an injury, so he's about 40 games behind Hanifin. So if the number starts with a 4, I'm quite happy with it, and I think the point whatever, is if that's all they're haggling about, if they're in a situation where the Oilers are offering 4 point something and the Nurse camp wants 6 point something and they're miles apart, well, then that's a whole different ballgame. But this is where actually having one of these contracts done with ink on the page with an actual figure on it is at least provides a template for the next negotiation.
Well, you make a reasonable argument there about a long-term deal with anything in a 4. I could. I'm not going to complain about either. I mean, Hanifin, Calgary can have that deal, and that's. I think it's a bit of an overpay. It's not much of one. If it is one, I don't buy the Sportsnet argument that Nurse would necessarily cost a lot. Should cost more than Hanifin. And I think the Oilers would be wise to wait. Let's see if Nurse becomes a point producer or not. I mean, he's already established himself as a top 4 D-man, and there's a price point for that. And if Nurse is willing to sign for that, which would be something with the 4 at the front, then yeah, do it. But if he wants more than that, then let's see if you can produce those points or not before we and just go short term then. If he does want the bigger contract. Anyway, I think we're arguing about something that's doesn't seem to be in the air with the Nurse and the Oilers. It seems to be in the air. He's going to sign short term. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's what all the insiders, the people who have some connections with management are saying, that a short term deal, and they're saying, I've heard numbers between 3 and 3.5 million. Right. So generally speaking, and with the Chiarelli bonus, it's going to be closer to the 3.5 probably than because whether rightly or wrongly, whether this is a fair comment or not, everyone says he pays a couple $100,000 more per deal than he should at least. So,
well, Low Tide yesterday on Hot Takes on TSN, he had a great one. He said that Nurse and Chiarelli are $400,000 apart in salary negotiations. Nurse wants 4.2, but Chiarelli is insisting on 4.6.
Good line by Low Tide. Yeah. So Chiarelli has this reputation
he sure does.
of not being the toughest bargainer in the NHL, and I think you can make that. I think there's an argument to be had there, Bruce. He doesn't exactly, to be Glenn, say they're sharpening his pencil on other people's foreheads during negotiations. He seems to be a guy who gives up a little bit too much, perhaps in trades and in negotiations, which is kind of a flaw, and maybe a fatal flaw in today's NHL, where every $100,000 income counts.
Well, in this negotiation, he sure could use that $300K in cap space that he burned on the Art Greibe situation, for instance, which was a tiny matter, but it was just one of those matters where you just kind of left you scratching your head. It's like you're watching someone take a $20 bill out of his wallet and throw it in the gutter for no apparent reason. Like I still don't understand that move. And in the end, they could have used Eric Greibe, the player, as training camp depth.
Yeah, well, look they brought in Garrison, right? And so they brought in Garrison. What if they signed Garrison now to even more than Greibe made? I mean, there is a certain
puzzling. It's puzzling.
You've always been sharpening that knife.
I just couldn't see the lot, and when it fails the logic test, that's when I start objecting. Right?
Next, you're going to raise.
I can see.
Next, you're going to raise Brian Ferlin, Bruce. You're going to start raising Brian Ferlin again.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, I mean, I defended for at least in theory, because it passed the logic test, the move for Griffin Reinhart. Failure as that turned out to be, I at least understood the logic of trading an 18-year-old draft pick for a 21-year-old progressing, evolving, emerging defenseman. Now, he did not emerge, and it turned out to be a massive fail, but at least it made sense on the one level of adding a player to the right age cluster. The Greibe situation, it's a tiny deal by comparison to that disaster of a trade, but I just can't find any logic that defends it. And right now, that little $300K, and I think even Nurse's agent may have mentioned that at one point, that the Oilers were tossing around cap space. Now he didn't have enough left for his client, and who's to argue?
I think it was in reference to Koskinen. The agent might have been. I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, and as for Griffin Reinhart, now I'm truly depressed. You always like Griffin Reinhart a little bit more than me, Bruce, or maybe a lot more. I never liked that trade, but I agree with you. I understood the logic of advancing the age group, but man, I never liked that.
Mm-hmm. Anyway,
I didn't like the performance of that player in his last year with the Oil Kings, let alone when they made the trade after.
When he was MVP,
mediocre year in the
playoffs, you mean that year?
Yeah, even when they won the Memorial Cup, I didn't really love his play. Like, honestly.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, back to Nurse. The one thing that's changed between the sort of consensus that they were going towards a bridge contract, of course, is the Secker injury, which opens the door for some long-term injury relief, which could be now justified as a reason and means to sign Nurse for a longer term. It would still mean some cagey contract management for the first day of the season. But maybe there's a crack of a window open there that wasn't there before, that maybe now they're back to saying maybe we should be talking 6 or 7 years with Darnell and not just 1 or 2.
I'd actually love to see it. I'm bullish on Darnell Nurse. I see him at least as a top 4 defenseman in the NHL for the next 6 or 7. Signing that guy up through his prime on a contract with a 4 in it, that I think that would work for me. That would be a happy day. And there's a chance that Nurse will be a top pairing defenseman. Certainly, I think in a support role, if he was paired with a strong puck moving defenseman on the right side, that probably not Adam Larsson. But he could. I mean, if you use Larsson and Nurse as kind of a top pairing and more like a super shutdown role, like all the tough situations, maybe that can be a formula for a winning team. But certainly with a real puck moving defenseman, I think Nurse could be the other guy. I think Stauffer mentioned, or someone mentioned Seabrook to someone's Duncan Keith. To Chicago's Duncan Keith, but of course the Oilers don't have a Duncan Keith. So, but I'm bullish on Nurse, and I expect he's going to get signed soon. Let's move on.
A couple other items, sorry, but just before we do, from the just their top stats line in Hockey Reference, because we did talk about box scores being important. Nurse plus 15, Hanifin minus 20. Take it for what it's worth, but the agent is going to be using that. And here's another one. Time on ice, 22 minutes, 15 seconds for Nurse, compared to 18:52 for Hanifin. This is last season again in both cases. And Nurse with the tougher zone starts of them. That's all information just on that top line. So the case can be made that Nurse has got more breadth to his game. The other case can be made Hanifin's a younger player with a higher, maybe future upside, with more offense. So they're not exact comparables. But at least, as I said previously, at least now we've got one of these 4 pack of young RFA D-men who's at least set the bar somewhere that they can use it and negotiate off of it.
I'd take Nurse over Hanifin every day of the week, and I mean Calgary can have him at that.
Going to have lots of chance to compare, David. He's in Calgary.
Indeed. So Bruce, we have another story that I wrote a post on today. It's more, the headline is "More Nonsense on McDavid in Edmonton," and a U.S. Buffalo, New York radio host from WGR 550, Joe DiBiase. So he tweeted out a picture of that great picture of McDavid rapidly stick handling through pucks at the BioSteel camp, and he noted, "It's such a shame for the game that this guy is in Edmonton." And his argument, as it was, Bruce, was that it's one that we've heard before. It's this notion that if McDavid was in a bigger market, I guess not Buffalo, that this would be good for the NHL in some way, that the ratings would be higher and there would be much more excitement and interest in the game, blah, blah, blah. And I just, it's easy, it's tempting just to ignore this kind of stuff. But I just really do think it's an indicative of kind of a lot of the negative spin and commentary about McDavid in Edmonton. And we're going to hear it again. And we've heard it in the past, and we're going to hear it more. And we hear it from U.S. and Eastern Canada media guys who think that the boundaries of the world, and after that there be dragons, is kind of the western suburbs of Toronto. It all kind of starts in New York, and after that, who knows what's
parallel. Take your pick.
Yeah, who knows what's out there? And I just think it's a flawed argument, and that he's making. And we see this, Bruce. Like, you can have teams capture the imagination from anywhere and become huge media sensations. And the best example of this, of course, is Manchester United. which is probably, Manchester's a city that no one would probably visit ever. It's an industrial city in northern England, but it has the most, either the most or in the running with Barcelona and Madrid for the most valuable soccer team in the entire world. This and it's part of it, I think, is the mystique of Manchester, this northern city. But there's something, I think the mystique is this. They play kind of a rugged, aggressive, attacking British, which is hard to press these days because most of the players are foreigners, style of play that's had all this success. Now, the key to it, of course, is success, which the Oilers haven't had lately. But the Oilers, Edmonton was building that kind of mystique. And if they hadn't sold Messi and Gretzky, that kind of mystique might have been much further embedded and around Edmonton. We might have won 3 or 4 more cups. But you can have that kind of mystique and aura and excitement around a team outside of Toronto and New York. And that might surprise some people not in Toronto and New York who think that's the whole world.
We can find a perfectly good example in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada in the 1980s when the touring Edmonton Oilers were the hottest ticket in all 20 other NHL cities. Or next thing to it, I mean, maybe there was a couple of local rivalries that were, but the Oilers league-wide, I'm sure they led the league in road attendance for a number of years in a row. I don't have the figures to hand, but I recall that. And anytime Edmonton came to town, it was a big deal in that town. And I mean, who cares? It's Gretzky's team that's coming through town, and they're wearing whatever color sweaters, and they got whatever name on the front. If you're a Philadelphia Flyer, let's do it this way. If you're a Pittsburgh Penguins fan, you're glad Sidney Crosby's on your team. And if you're a Philadelphia Flyers fan, you hate the Penguins and you hate the fact that Sidney Crosby is on the Penguins team, but and that draws you out to that game that you'd already be going to anyway, right? Whereas now you've got a reason to go and see that game. Plus, when Edmonton comes to town, you want to see that game and see McDavid. Like, I don't know what the draw other than this national TV bit. And you know what? If the networks in the United States consistently refuse to show teams from north of the border, as they have done for many years, that's on them. Like week after week, you watch the NHL on NBC, and you got Philadelphia versus Pittsburgh. You got LA versus Anaheim or San Jose. You got St. Louis versus Chicago, and you got the same. It's like they shrunk the league down to a 6-team American league. Add the Rangers, obviously, in Detroit into that mix. But this year, our friend Jeff Chapman, who took on this DiBiase character, pointed out that even on NBCSN that has the NHL broadcast now, which goes to show, I mean, that's like way, way down the cable dial in the States, goes to show. And even there, they're showing the Oilers 6 times and the Sabres with Dallin and Eichel, mind, 3 times. So they are at least starting to, for years they ignored the Oilers, but at least they're starting to include them. Now, my take to DiBiase was here in Canada, McDavid's on national TV quite a lot. It is a 2-country league here, folks. I mean, the Americans own the friggin' Stanley Cup already. That's enough to piss any Canadian off. But they don't, and they get all of most of the star players in the second half of their career, as we saw with those 80s Oilers. But they don't just by right should have all of these players. Maybe if you're talking about a perfect world scenario, what would be the best sell for the league? Maybe, but we don't live in the perfect world. It's just in.
Yeah, the big European cities, Bruce, even with the kind of market that they have in Europe, where the richest teams can get the best players. The best teams aren't always in the biggest cities. London doesn't have necessarily the best teams. Paris doesn't necessarily. I mean, they do have Paris Saint-Germain, which is becoming something, but it's not necessarily the case that the best team is going to be in Rome or Berlin, or they're often in second or third or fifth biggest cities in the country. So even in that system, you have it where the great draws and when Manchester United plays, Bruce, the whole world watches. So you can't just this argument that smaller market teams can't be huge draws on TV and otherwise. There's just doesn't hold, I don't think. But it's not the first time that I'm going to just remind you of the the first time we heard this argument in terms of McDavid was when the Oilers won the lottery, and Jeff Blair of Sportsnet and a Toronto radio host, he went so far as to suggest the NHL should have rigged the lottery so that McDavid went to the Leafs.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And he said, with the Leafs so bad, the Toronto hockey market is softening up. And his quote was, McDavid would have been of maximum marketing value and would have had the most immediate positive impact in Toronto. And he said, because Toronto is a rich hockey market, it deserves McDavid. The Maple Leafs have bankrolled the NHL for a long time. It would have been nice to get a McBone thrown in their direction, you know.
Like Austin Matthews, you mean? Yeah, they got a nice bone thrown in there.
Well, that came after, of course.
He wrote. No, but I mean, that's the nature of the system, is that the weak teams do have their chance at being replenished. Now, let's be frank here. Edmonton's lucky to win the particular lottery that they did. And some teams, including Buffalo, and especially Vancouver, have been especially unlucky in the lottery year after year. And that's the nature of the lottery, which they brought in originally because teams were blatantly tanking for to get the top pick. And there's no perfect solution, but if you want to get a situation where it's rigged, where, I mean, let's look at baseball. No salary caps in baseball, and the best players trend towards the top teams after they played their entry level and gone through their first few years. And so the lower teams, the low budget teams, they better win when their guys are young, or at least be competitive when their guys are young. But you get to a situation like this year where you could look at the baseball before the start of the season and say, well, these 5 teams are going to be in the playoffs in the American League, and these 5 are going to be in the playoffs in the National League, and these other 20 teams are also Rams. And it's not quite that much of a divide, but close. There was only really a handful of playoff teams, and some you could write in pen that they're for sure going to make the playoffs. And they're in the bigger markets, and maybe that's what you want. I don't know. I'd rather have a competitive league myself.
Yeah, I don't mind the salary cap league. Even though, like, I mean, the Oilers could compete now for players. They're one of in the top 10 or 15 money markets for the NHL. So it's not like we were in the late 90s when the dollar was so low and the economy tanked here. The Oilers could compete financially now, but I like the salary cap league and the revenue sharing.
And as soon as Curtis Joseph's contract or Doug Waite's contract was up, they were gone.
Yeah, those days are gone. And if there was no salary cap, they would also be gone because this is a fairly rich hockey market now. Bruce, let's finish up this podcast just really quickly going through the goalie prospects in our prospect series.
Sure.
So we've been rating the prospects this summer, and for the goalies, we're done with them. And we had Dylan Wells at number 23, Hayden Hockey at 18, Olivier Rodrigue at 13, and Stuart Skinner at 7. And the only comment I would make, like, I don't have a lot to say about particular goalies, and you know, I tend to rate them by their save percentages and kind of obvious things, as opposed to like, I'm just not expert enough in that position to even provide a fan, like a informed fan's view of it, honestly. So I'm not going to talk about their technique or that kind of thing. I don't have anything really to add. But I would say that when you look at the sheer number of goalies and their ages, looks like the Oilers finally have some depth and some pretty solid depth at that position. Stuart Skinner had just a fantastic season last year. Rodrigue was the highest rated Canadian goalie in this year's draft.
Yes.
Wells he was on a bad team and had a tough time last year, but has been a good goalie in the past. So they've got some players there, Bruce.
Well, 4 out of the 4 guys that made our top 25, and I'll point out Shane Starrett, a 1-year pro after being a free agent signing out of college last year. But he was number 26. And the other 4 guys above him on our list have played a combined 0 pro games. So they're very much an open book, but they're also very much a a depth in the goaltending pool that the Oilers have not had in a long, long time. I worry a little bit that there's so many of them that they're going to get in each other's way a little bit for ice time. This pesky rule that you can only use one goalie at a time is going to limit them, a little bit. That said, I mean, Stuart Skinner and Olivier Rodrigue, I think those are the top two prospects we got going here. And in each case, the Oilers traded up. They traded 2 draft picks for 1 to select these guys. Skinner in the 3rd round, Rodrigue in the 2nd. And Skinner, in his 1 year since his draft, and he's a late birthday, so he's ready to turn pro now. But his 1 year he had a pretty good first half in Lethbridge, and then he got traded to Manny Viveros' team there, and they went berserk in the second half of the season. And he was a big part of the reason. He was fantastic in the playoffs, had a wonderful playoff run, and had a good showing in the Memorial Cup even when the team finally collapsed. They played 26 playoff games to get to the Memorial Cup, and they had nothing left. And he had one game where he faced like 58 shots or some bloody thing, and they lost 2-1. And he was fantastic in that game. And that was so he's a very interesting prospect, big man, covers a lot of net, and this connection with Manny Viveros is potentially interesting. But I mean, down the road, he's obviously not factoring into the NHL.
Skinner, we saw Skinner, Bruce, at the dev camp, right? We saw him up close live.
Yep.
And it was funny because sometimes when you're like, well, especially, I don't know about you, but when I'm watching players, I kind of get these glimpses or visions of players past. They just suddenly remind me some move they make, or just he is one big guy, Stuart Skinner, and just his size, his bulk in the net, the way he was moving, and kind of his confidence. He just suddenly had this thought of Ken Dryden popped into my head when I was watching Stuart Skinner play. And which was a very happy thought. I think Ken Dryden was my first hockey hero. He beat the Bruins in that early round. I think it was what year was that? What playoff year was that?
71.
71. That's when I became a hockey fan. Was with that series, and Ken Dryden stoning Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito and the Boston Bruins. Anyway, Skinner there was just a moment there where I thought, man, he got that same kind of massiveness in net, but also presence that Dryden had. So
he made one save in that Billy Morris Cup, and it was on a cross ice pass across the Royal Road, and the guy on the far face-off circle wired a one-timer, and he didn't miss, right? And Skinner got across the net, and it was the agility on that one save that made me think, oh, okay, he's not just a big guy that fills the net, he can move in the net. And so maybe, I mean, what are you going to get out of one save? But the fact is that if he was an immobile goalie, he would never have made that save in 50 chances. And so that's not an issue. You've got a big guy who can move. Well, I don't know that he's Ken Dryden, but I don't know that he isn't Ken Dryden. So there's that.
We'll see. Yeah, it's obviously a hyperbolic kind of. It's more like a flashing vision rather than a comparison.
You're such a young guy, though, David. My first goaltending hero was Johnny Bauer, the China Wall. The late.
I thought it was going to be Georges Vezina.
Yeah. Johnny was. Well, not quite, but Johnny was already pushing 40 by the time I started watching hockey, and he played, of course, into his 40s. So it's a different era altogether, and there's no comparison to be made between him and any of these guys. Now, this Olivier Rodrigue, he's pretty, he's an intriguing guy. He was, I wrote the report on him for our prospect series, and I noticed how almost all of the starters in the Quebec League were 19, 20, even 21 years old by the end of the season. And Rodrigue, there was only like one starter younger than him, and that guy isn't even going to be drafted till next year. So he's we're going to hear some more buzz. I can't recall his name off the top of my head here, but
he had a great save percentage. That
Rodrigue,
other player.
Rodrigue had good numbers, and he was in like the top 3 in the league in games started. Like, so, he wasn't just like a 17-year-old kid playing halftime. He started most of his team's games. Minutes played, he was at 3,000 minutes for the season, which is very substantial for a netminder. He was, I think, third in the league in goals against average, and second in wins or something, and sixth in save percentage. So a little bit lower there, but still, in a league, 18-team league, he was like well up the leaders in every major goaltending category as a 17-year-old.
He plays a really calm
Mm-hmm.
game, Bruce. I thought just watching him play, although he's a smaller goalie, he just seemed to be really smooth, calm. Kind of that Cam Talbot style of play where you're not sprawling all over the net. In fact, the opposite. You're just kind of moving with the puck constantly and always in the right position. That's the whole idea of it.
Technically, very
Dad is an NHL goalie coach, so I think he's in.
Sylvain Rodrigue, his dad, is in the Oilers system as a goaltending coach, which some will see as a bad sign that they drafted somebody who's related to one of the suits on the team. Well, he's not actually a suit; he's out there on the ice. And Sylvain is actually going to be full-time down in Bakersfield this year, as I understand it, or in the minors, working with all these young guys that are turning pro. So he won't be working with his own son yet. But his son is clearly, a chip off the old block. He's learned a thing or two from the old man in the sense that his technical. He impressed me with his ability to seal the two goal posts, which is two different techniques for blocker versus glove side, right? And good on both sides, as you say, track the puck well, and he just seemed to be a very sound positional goalie. And with the capacity of making the sensational save, but more the capacity of just being in the right place, so the shooter's probably going to hit him. And I thought his rebound control looked pretty good, and puck movement looked pretty good. Like he's got a fairly technically sound game, especially for a guy that just turned 18 over the summer. So we'll see. I mean, he's years off, and that's actually a good thing. You got all these guys. You got Wells and Skinner both turning pro this year. Hayden Hockey, who we haven't talked about yet, who's a little older but in college with one more year to run. Sort of insurance policy of an older goalie, and then you got a guy who's got 2 years, currently 2 years in junior. I think he's a big factor probably in Team Canada World Junior, if not this year, then next year for sure. And by the time he turns pro in 2 years, some of these other guys, we'll know what they are, and there'll be a space for a new young goalie in the system.
It's interesting. We criticize Shirley maybe a little less than some other people. Some people really criticize the guy, but you can make up for a lot of mistakes if you draft well. And the Oilers haven't drafted well for 20, 25 years. It's been really, really bad for the franchise. Obviously, since the 1980s, the Oilers about 1985, the Oilers haven't really drafted that well. Is the truth. And but if this new era, Bruce, if they're getting it right, and it's too hard to know, right? Because there's been excitement with other draft leaders of the Oilers. There's some excitement around Stu McGregor and some different draft classes, and there's always the hope, and you just don't know. But if they are getting it right with these drafts, if we start to get two or three players even who are NHLers out of these drafts, as opposed to one or none, that's going to be huge for the Edmonton Oilers. And if Chiarelli's doing that, he's setting a base for future success for this team. Yeah. And we don't know, but we have an inkling that maybe there's certainly a lot of hope with players like Skinner and Maximov and Ethan Bear, that we're starting to move in that direction where we're going to get some NHL players out of unexpected draft picks.
Somewhere out of in the top 10 of the first round. Yeah, that'd be real nice, eh? You say 85, I say 83. So it's basically,
Well, what year was Tikkanen drafted, Bruce?
Yeah, 83.
What year is Tikkanen? I think Tikkanen. He
was in the first 5 years. Barry Fraser was on a roll. The first 3 years are three of the great years, especially to consider consecutively, maybe the three best draft years in succession in history. Very close. if not. And then in '83, you got a couple more good players, and then it just obviously they moved down to the very bottom of the draft roll, but they got nothing out of it, and it was. I think they also got Boom in '83. Anyway, after that, poof, and so few picks.
Okay, let's go to. I said '85. So in '85, they got Kelly Bookberger in the.
Yeah, well, you need a guy like that, like once every 2 or 3 years, not once every 20 years.
Yeah, that draft. So Bruce, here let's just real quick. After Fuhr was taken in '81, here are their first picks: Jim Playfair, Jeff Boom. So '83, and '83 they got Tikkanen.
Yeah.
So that draft's covered, right? You got two good players out of there. Next year they take Selmar Odolin. Year after that, Scott Metcalf. Year after that, Kim Eisel. Then Peter Soberlach in '87. Francois Leroux in '88. Jason Souls, '89. Scott Allison, '90. Tyler Wright, '91. And he became a player. And they also took Martin Rudchinski that year. So that draft was the first draft that was covered.
The draft was good, except they traded both guys when they were like 19 years old.
Oh, and here's one of my favorite. Do you remember Joe Hulbig in '92? Okay, Jason Arnott and Nick Staduhar first round in '93. So Nick, they hit it with Jason Arnott, but he was traded too. Then '94, Jason Bonsignor. Of course, with the second pick that round, they took Ryan Smith. And then the famous pick in '95, Steve Kelly over Shane Doan. '96, Boyd Devereaux. '97, Michelle Reason. 98, Michael Henrik. 99, Yanni Rita. 2000, Alexei Mikhnov. Oh, and here we go again. Here's another. Okay.
Alex Hemsky, number one. And
Alex Hemsky, that was his first pick for Prendergast. But then they took, after Prendergast hit it big with his first pick, they take in the next 2 years, they take Yassi Niittymaki, and instead of Zach Parise, they take Marc-Antoine Pouliot. Anyway, let's just leave it there because then they get into the higher picks after that.
There was a huge list of guys that they could have picked in '03.
What a disastrous record that. What a Barry Fraser.
That's the first round you're talking about. Now, since then, they've started to stabilize because they've been picking so often in the top few picks. They've got decent first round picks. But if you look at rounds 2 through 7, it sucks. Like, I think they got one guy, Jujhar Khaira, a third round pick, that really factors into the team at present, unless you count Toby Reeder and Kyle Brodziak. There are guys Oilers drafted, but then they traded them before they became NHL regulars and have since reacquired them. So you could say they're Oilers draft choices. And I guess you could say credit the scouts. They picked those players that worked out. But between drafting, development, and actually keeping a player until he gets good, you put those three things together, and the Oilers have stunk it out for decades.
So in the last 3 years, they've taken they took Ethan Bear, Caleb Jones, and McDavid, and I guess Marino's still in the running from 2015. The 2016 draft is a huge question mark still, obviously. I mean, but and a lot depends on how Jesse Puljujärvi turns out. But there's also Tyler Benson from that year, who's kind of got, not up or down arrows, maybe a little bit down arrows, but kind of even arrows. But there's Philip Berglund, who's still very much in the running, who's become a really good defenseman in the Swedish league, and Graham McPhee, who's become a quite an interesting college winger. Like he seems to. There's some things that you think could translate to the NHL, and there's Dylan Wells still, and then there's the 2017 draft with Yamamoto, Skinner, Samorukov, Safin, and Maximov. Lots of up arrows there, and Maximov's really got people excited, and Samorukov and Skinner. So, and then there's this year with Bouchard, McLeod, Rodrigue. So, yeah, we'll see. It's still too early, Bruce. But the fact that Bear and Caleb Jones are hanging in there as real solid prospects
for where they got picked in the
for where they got picked. That's right.
Over 100. When you need prospect over number 100, it's a long shot. And there's a few of the guys in that number range from the last 3 drafts that really do factor into our prospects list. So progress is being made. We think. I mean, it's a 5+ year before you can say with certainty. But there's a lot of up arrows, as you say. And we'll be talking in our future podcasts about the D-men and the wingers. And that's where, in fact, the top 4 of our prospect list are clustered in those 2 positions. So we'll have at least some positive things to discuss in those future podcasts.
When does the rookie camp start? Is it next week?
Yeah, it's coming up right away. I mean, they start playing NHL exhibition games on the 15th. Yeah. So it'll be I should know this date by now, but it's still summer to me. I know it's coming up around the corner. They're playing rookie games. They're playing a game against Nate and McEwen combined team here in Edmonton on the 11th. They're playing the Flames rookie in Red Deer on the 12th. Those are 2 dates I can give you. So probably the 8th. They start 7th.
No young guns in Kelowna this year, I guess.
No, they bailed. Vancouver overplayed their hand from the sounds of it, and other teams bailed on.
What do you mean?
Vancouver was the host, and there was some disagreement about how they were going about business, and Edmonton, Calgary, and I think Winnipeg all pulled out. I lost interest the moment Edmonton pulled out, but I think the whole thing kind of collapsed.
I heard some people making a bit of a deal about that. I mean, I don't. They're just, for the prospects, are just one more. Like they're not real teams playing each other. There's just kind of like a bunch of individuals playing each other in an exhibition game. I don't think it's that big a deal to lose that. In fact, it might be better off just stay close to home and practice with these guys and
set up your own tournament in Red Deer and see what happens.
Yeah, they're going to play the Flames, so they're Flames.
One game anyway.
Well, Bruce, let's leave it.
That game.
Oh yeah, that'd be good. Let's leave it there, Bruce. And thanks for talking today, Bruce.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone.
And in the meantime, and in between times, this has been another edition of the Cult of Hockey podcast broadcast.